All right, ladies and gentlemen, happy Monday. Hope everyone had a good weekend as we enter into the calendar month of December now. And as I alluded to you guys on Friday, I'll be up at Founders until tomorrow with the basketball team in retreat. So we all wish you the best down there in school today. So Friday we had the opportunity to talk a little bit about trimesters. Okay, your classwork that will be up should be up on eBackpack now after this lesson. Would be to make a Quizlet, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a few minutes. But Thursday we had left off talking about an event that is in many ways going to spark a change in the course of history, which is known as the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre, an event, not necessarily an act or a tax that is passed by King George III in Parliament, but rather an event that we spoke about on Thursday as being something that was certainly chaotic. You had a British soldier, Hugh White, keeping guard of a government building where the British had stored money, and an angry, robust crowd starts to scream and yell at this one soldier, which causes a commotion, and with just over 100 colonists on King Street in Boston, and coming to the defense of the one soldier, 7 other British soldiers, for whatever reason, a shot was fired. And as we said on Thursday, the colonists were not at fault here. They very much instigated this scenario, okay, not only by screaming at the British soldiers, yelling at them, poking fun at them, but also throwing things at them, okay, whether it was snowballs or ice or stones or oyster shells. One British soldier was actually struck in the face with a club. So regardless, we do not necessarily know, even today, as to whether or not an actual order was made. Thomas Preston, who was the commanding officer, British officer, who came to the aid of Hugh White, said that he never said and ordered his men to fire, but nonetheless, a shot went off, which followed then by a series of other shots. And we said on Thursday, Crispus Attucks becomes the first martyr of the revolution, someone who died for a cause. Now, I've been giving you guys a theme all year that perception, depending on what side of history you're on, is going to be very different. And after what happened there on the night of March 5th of 1770, a very important date to know, I will tell you, you should make sure that you remember this date because it is, in fact, the Boston Massacre, a very important event. Paul Revere is going to take quill to paper to depict, as we said on Thursday, what actually transpired on that night. And Paul Revere's depiction of what transpired here on King Street is what becomes known throughout the 13 colonies as not just the Bloody Massacre, but the Boston Massacre. Okay, this particular picture depicts the deliberate attack of British soldiers on unarmed and innocent civilians. Okay, is this exactly what happened? No. Okay, but you could see here, doesn't really matter what exactly happened. Okay, this picture doesn't show the colonists instigating or yelling or throwing things at the British. Okay, you have a depiction of a British soldier back here giving an order to fire. Okay, his sword is raised as if he's telling his troops to fire. And you'll notice here, okay, civilians, they don't have weapons, they don't have anything in their hands, they're not throwing anything. So this is only going to further enrage the colonists. If it could happen in Boston, and as we said, there is a large British presence, over 2,000 troops in Boston. If this can happen in Boston, what says it won't happen in New York City? Or what says it won't happen in Philadelphia? Or what says it won't happen in Charleston, where British troops may fire upon innocent civilians? Okay, so it causes public outrage. Now, Thomas Hutchinson, who was the colonial governor of Massachusetts, and he is sympathetic to the British cause. He would be considered a loyalist. He is someone that was appointed to the position by King George. His hands are tied, and the colonists are are outraged at what had transpired, and they want to see justice. And they want to see these soldiers arrested and put on trial for murder, a crime that would be punishable by execution, by a public hanging, so to speak. So Hutchinson, as the governor, has to have these soldiers arrested, and for the most part, everyone in Boston figures that this would be a trial that we would consider to be a slam dunk, meaning that these troops would be put on trial, and then eventually these troops would have to answer to the law, okay, meaning that they most likely would be found guilty. Now, if you're a defense attorney in Boston, you wouldn't want to go anywhere near this trial. However, John Adams, obviously, I'm sure many of you know and have heard of John Adams before. He is will eventually become our second president. He is our country's first vice president as well. As a lawyer, he feels as though it's his civic duty to give these soldiers a fair trial. So he agrees to defend these soldiers in court. And very famously, John Adams is going to defend these soldiers on the premise that there was no intent on the part of the British soldiers, that they were acting out of self-defense, that it was a very much an unruly crowd that had surrounded these soldiers, and nonetheless, this is something that really could have been avoided. Okay, and he's able to plant the seed in the jury that there is, not necessarily unreasonable doubt that these men committed murder. And a jury, hearing Adams and his defense, will make the ruling that they are, in fact, all the soldiers are not guilty. Two of these 9 soldiers who were put on trial who admitted to firing their weapon were found guilty of manslaughter, and therefore that would be a crime punishable by having their thumbs branded. So if you were to take a hot cast iron, a lot of times you see the branding of animals, maybe with your initials, so to speak, on an animal here. It would be a branding of the British seal, the British crown there on their thumb. So at the time, John Adams is not a popular guy because he basically was able to convince a jury where colonists felt as though that it would be his job as someone living in the colonies to kind of, not do his job, just easily have these guys be found guilty for murder. But he does do his job. It puts him really as a focal point of the colonial cause. But John Adams, although a lawyer, you would first call him a patriot. He does believe in the idea of colonial self-government, and he will certainly play a major role moving forward in America's cause for independence. So the Boston Massacre, as I said, certainly an event that changes history, but also has key figures of the Revolution like John Adams come to the limelight here. After the fallout of the Boston Massacre, what we began to see is the colonies keep or want to keep a particular interest in knowing what was going on in all of these major cities, especially Boston, considering that there were 2,000 plus troops. And after the Boston Massacre, as it's called throughout the colonies, people began to realize that what's happening in other cities could be happening in their city soon. So a ardent patriot, someone who was vocal about their dislike for the British crown, a man by the name of Samuel Adams, who was actually John Adams's cousin, who we just mentioned, was the more prominent member of the Adams family, not the Adams family from the movies and cartoons or whatever, but from the Adams family of the 1770s. You get the point. Samuel Adams, though, in his position, was able to help form what became known as the Committee of Correspondence, okay, which was a secret group that was supposed to help the colonies keep in closer contact with each other. Okay, remember, back then there was no social media. Okay, it's not as though someone was taking a picture and putting it on Instagram and saying, here, this is what happened here in Boston. So in order for news to travel, you would need to write letters, or you would need to send down the week's newspaper down to New York City so that people can read about what was happening in Boston. And then eventually that newspaper would make its way down to North Carolina and even Georgia. So the Committee of Correspondence became a unique way of keeping the colonies in closer contact with each other. They were to discuss what was going on, how certain groups were protesting and boycotting what certain things and certain goods. And in reality, the Committee of Correspondence was a growing group that helped the colonies not just stay in closer contact, but to bring them closer together, as I have here in the notes. It does certainly promote colonial unity at the time, like we had seen in the Join or Die political cartoon by Franklin. The Committee of Correspondence moving forward is going to be the big thing that helped the colonies keep in closer contact. Now, each colony in most cases had their own committees. So while Samuel Adams helped to kind of get this going, he was like one of the point people in Boston. Whereas you might have some other people in Virginia like Patrick Henry or Richard Henry Lee or Benjamin Harrison, who became part of the committee in Virginia that represented, things that were going on there. So almost every colony had their own committee, and that way those people can help keep in contact with each of the 13 colonies. But as we've seen in this section, a lot has happened, since the ending of the French and Indian War. We have a group of people here in the colonies that are growing more and more upset. They're growing upset. Anything greater than zero when it came to taxes was going to be upsetting. Anything that they felt as though was a violation of their rights. We've seen protests. We've seen boycotts. We've now seen protests turn violent. Blood has now been shed. And certainly, as we're going to see here in Section 3, the relationship between the colonies and the home country is not necessarily getting better, but rather, it's only getting worse. Section 3, which you guys have read and already answered some key terms, and part of your classwork tomorrow is going to be to work on the questions for Section 3, is entitled A Call to Take Action. And in many ways, the fallout still from the Boston Massacre lingers throughout the 13 colonies. And for Britain, as the situation gets more tense, there's a call for resolution on the part of the British. They're losing out on money in the colonies, and we've said from the beginning of the year, colonies are in existence to make the home country wealthy. So Britain wants to try to figure out how they can make money, but at the same time, keep the colonists happy. Now, the one thing we talked about with the Townshend Acts being repealed back in 1770 was that the British were still going to tax tea. And even though imported goods were no longer going to be taxed, the fact that tea was taxed was an upsetting thing to the colonists. And now, what the British want to do is try to find out a creative way to deal with the successful boycotts of the colonists. Simply because of that slight tax on tea, colonists feel as though that their rights are being infringed upon. So in 1773, an act that was supposed to help the colonists, in reality, is only going to make them further upset. Now, as we've talked about,
in 1773,
what we're going to see
Townshend Acts being repealed
is the British
and only
are going to pass what is known as the Tea Act.
The colonists, but
so
at the
as
end
you
of the
can
day,
imagine,
the fact that only
the Tea Act
was being
is going
taxed,
to,
some
in fact, be a
colonists
tax
decided
on
that, you know
tea.
what, at the end of the day, if tea is the only thing taxed, I'm still going to drink tea. However, most colonists, even though tea was the only thing being taxed, still would rather buy smuggled tea, like Dutch tea, instead of giving the British any semblance of a profit. So, as time wore on after the repealing of the Townshend Acts, one company in particular, known as the British East India Company, began to go through financial hardships. And because of these hardships, the company that was so vital to England's imperial success, meaning their colonies all over the world, they were unable to make a huge profit in the colonies. So in 1773, what the British Parliament decides to do is pass what becomes known as the Tea Act. Now, most people would hear Tea Act, oh, this must be a tax on tea, like the Sugar Act was a tax on sugar. Well, the Tea Act, in effect, is going to keep the same tax on tea. But the reality was the Tea Act was really passed to help one of their failing companies, the British East India Company. And what the British East India Company had effectively done here in the colonies was they had a monopoly on tea distribution, meaning that all imported British tea was sent in from this company. Well, if they're not making money in the colonies, the one way to do that is to effectively help them. So what the Tea Act did was it repealed, for the most part, the Navigation Acts. It said that the British East India Company no longer would have to send their tea to England first, like we said with the Navigation Acts, and then on to the colonies. And why did we say back in chapter 3, what was the point of that? So that England could tax the tea, so that they could get a cut before it was sold, and therefore the companies like the British East India Company would then increase the price of tea to make up for that tax. Well, now all of a sudden, ships leaving India no longer need to go to England. They can go directly to the colonies. So because of that, even though there's still an import tax, the price of tea is actually going to drop. Okay, so say for argument's sake, a pound of tea, again using round numbers, is $1. Now all of a sudden, the British East India Company could sell it for 60 cents, 50 cents for that matter, if the price is, at times cut even in half. Now, how do you think the colonists would feel about this? Well, as you can imagine, as I mentioned last week, it seems as though that if the British sneeze wrong, it's going to upset the colonists. Well, the Tea Act, although it lowers the price of tea, angers the colonists. Why? Well, now colonial merchants who have been smuggling in tea, they can't even compete with the lower price, because for years they had been selling tea at a lower price, and even though that they're doing things illegally, most colonists were getting their tea from these people, and now they can't compete with these prices. So what's happening? Well, colonists are now saying, well, you know what? If it's going to be that much cheaper, I might just go and buy the British tea. So now there is a huge concern in the colonies that Parliament is again going out of their way to impose laws, to impose taxes that are going to upset the colonists here. And as a result, a group known as the Sons of Liberty wants to turn their protest and boycott into action, which results in one of the most famous parties of all time. And as you can imagine, the Boston Tea Party will be the focal point of our next lesson. So we're going to stop here for today, because as I mentioned on Friday, I do want you guys to have some time to work on today's classwork. So here's the deal. What I want you to do now is I want you to take a look at your trimester 1 review sheets, and I want you to look through all of those IDs, whether it's a person, whether it's a place, whether it's a religious group like the Puritans and Quakers, an explorer, a colonial leader, a battle we talked about, a Native American or what have you. And I want you to create a 15-question Quizlet based off of that trimester review. It could be any question, okay? It could be, what is the definition of a culture? What is, or I should say, who is Benjamin Franklin? And your answer should be something that you think would be the answer on a test. Okay, so if I were to say you were to do Christopher Columbus, don't write the answer is an explorer. You would want to write what Christopher Columbus, if I were to use his name in a matching column on a trimester exam, what do you think I would put? So put yourself in my shoes today. All right, so those 15 questions, as I mentioned, we're going to hold on, or you're obviously going to hold on to those Quizlets. I'm not going to check them, okay, but what I am going to do starting on Wednesday is get the human random selector button going in Power School, and each of you is going to mirror up your Quizlet, so each day between Wednesday and the end of the trimester, we will be spending at least 5 minutes a day reviewing for the trimester. So hopefully all of your Quizlets are different, and in many ways I think we'll be able to knock out most of, if not all of, that review sheet, especially if we're doing a different set of 15 identifications a day. So choose wisely. The only thing I would ask is that you try to get a mix, a kind of a variety of things. So don't just do all the explorers. Try to get an explorer, an event, Bacon's Rebellion, William Penn, Jacques Cartier, and Lexington and Concord. Look it up in your iBook. That would be, a wide variety of things. So again, keep in mind what you put into your Quizlet is what not only what you're going to get out of it, but also your fellow classmates starting on Wednesday. So I think that's a great way for us as a class to help each other out in preparing for
your exam. So I'll be back tomorrow afternoon. If you guys have any questions on today's lesson, feel free to stop by. On Wednesday, we'll pick up with specifically the fallout of the T Act, and obviously an opportunity for us to fill out the rest of our British Acts chart. So that will be our part of our classwork tomorrow. All right, guys. Have an excellent day. Make sure you say thank you to your substitute for spending some time with you today. Now get going on that Quizlet and look forward to seeing those on Wednesday. Take care.